So, about a week ago, I put out this poll on my community tab to see what you guys thought of my idea, that being that when it comes to specifically one and done authors, that there isn't really a difference between those who have only written one book and those who have written three books in a trilogy. Now, I was more hoping to see some actual comments and discussion about this topic, which I didn't really see on this, so I thought might as well make a video explaining my own thought process behind it to kind of spark some discussion to see uh, where the rest of the community seems to stand on this issue. Um, just note, um, on the topic of a one and done, you can get very pedantic with how you define a one and done, being of is it one and done just with the books, just with the comics, or with short stories, as several of the authors have kind of cross branch. We've even had authors like Drew Karpyshyn, for example, who wrote video games and novels, ones who wrote books and comics, and almost everyone has a short story somewhere. But for the purposes of this video, I'm specifically just going to talk about the one and done authors as it regards to the adult novels. Um, but but know that I am aware that some of these authors are not exactly one and dones because they've written short stories. Just for simplicity's sake, in argument's sake, I'm going to keep the discussion to just the adult novels. So then that brings us to what is a one and done author? An author that only wrote one one book. Well, to the best of my knowledge, these are the one and done authors, those who have strictly read or written only one Star Wars Legends book. Some of these authors have actually written only one novel, but jointly, by the way, so that's why there's a little more faces than you might be familiar with. But the more I think about that, the more of that the fact that a one and done is someone who only wrote one story or one book, I don't think that's true because I think there are several authors who wrote an entire trilogy, but but are still counted into the one and done category because while they do have one trilogy, three books, they still have contributed to the overall Star Wars expanded universe, to the canon, and to the history of the EU. Only one story. And to make that example, I have two authors that I'm just going to use for the purposes of the example to kind of illustrate this point. This being Kristen Catherine Rush and Michael P.Q. McDowell. Both of these authors uh, had Star Wars Legends books, which were commissioned and came out in 1996. Both of them under Bantam Spectra. Both actually came out again in 1996, and both within the timeline continuity also happened around the same time. New Rebellion happens, roughly speaking, a few months after the events of the Black Fleet Crisis. Not only that, but these are not just one and done stories in the sense that they were written and then everyone forgot about them. Both of them are referenced later on in New Jedi Order and subsequent series. Michael P. Q. McDowell's Black Fleet Crisis, for example, several characters from it show up in the New Jedi Order, and the main antagonist, their storyline is wrapped up within the Force Heretic trilogy. Similar, New Rebellion features part of the story of Luke's fallen student Brachus, whose story is continued later on in the Shadow Academy arc of Young Jedi Knights. Both of these are stories that are significant to the Bantam era, that are significant to the New Republic era, and are significant to the overall story in all these ways. But they are only one story. The only difference between them is that Christie wrote a single book, whereas Michael P.Q. McDowell wrote three. But I don't think that you can just take the argument of three books is more than one as the defining trait of what constitutes a one and done. Because we know how Bantam and Del Rey do their writing structure. It's not so much that, well, this is true that authors have come to Del Rey or Bantam with an idea and gotten that idea greenlit. The actual commissioning and the green lighting of the book comes from the publishers. They are the ones that decide this book is going to get made. They are the ones that decide how many books are going to get made, and they're the ones who decide which author writes these books, and they decide which authors are going to come back. So on the topic of a one and done, I think a one and done is an author who is given one story. They wrote their one story, and then that they just did not write another story. They didn't come back for one reason or another. But specifically, if you're going to make the argument, if you're going to stick to the argument of trilogies being more books, and longer books than just one story, say, should count to more, I would like to provide a counter example of Brian Daley and L. Neil Smith. Both of these are trilogy authors for Star Wars in the 80s. Brian Daley wrote the Han Solo trilogy, the Han Solo Adventures, while L. Neil Smith wrote the Lando Calrissian trilogy, or Lando Calrissian Adventures. Each of these are 3 novels, but their novels are only about 140-ish on average in the case of L. Neil Smith, and 180 on average in the case of Brian Daley, pages long. Whereas generally speaking, a book is at the very least twice that, if not 3 times that length, um, within Legends. Usually Legends books are around the 300 to 450 page counts. So these are fairly light when you, and overall in page count and word count, don't quite stack up to the rest of the novels as one entry. But when you combine them, they do reach that range of the page count, and they do reach the relative size of the other stories. And you'll know this, and even the publishers knew this, because when they went to reprint them decades later, they reprinted them in 3-in-1s. Both Bantam, Spectra, and later Del Rey collected them into a 3-in-1. So on the one hand, you have this thing where each of these have essentially written a trilogy. They've written 3 books. But it's very hard to get a hold of the original 3 books in their entirety. If you're looking for these books, you're much more likely to find the 3-in-1 collections. In fact, I would hazard a guess that there are some fans out there who think they only each wrote 1 book, and that 1 book just had 3 stories in it. So again, back to the point of one trilogy is one story. I think that holds true. That these, while they are 3 books, and technically, it is still one story. And then these 2 authors have each contributed, in effect, one story to the overall Star Wars canon within Legends, and thus they are one and dones. Now, I want to also move over to some case studies here. These authors are not, in fact, most of these are not what I would classify as a one and done, but they produce some interesting scenarios that I think are worth discussion. And why I also think it's not as simple as one story equals an author that only wrote one story is a one and done. I think there's a little bit more nuance to that, and I think you have to take a case by case basis. The first example of this, although again not an example of a one and done, but an example of how this can kind of get muddy, is with Timothy Zahn, because a lot of people might not know this, but the Hand of Thrawn duology was actually originally supposed to be 1 book. He was only originally signed on to write 1 book. The problem was when he actually wrote it out, it ended up being 1,000 pages long, and he felt that that was way too long for a single book, and he didn't want to try to pare it down. So he got Bantam to agree to lengthen it to a duology. Thus, we have the Hand of Thrawn duologies. So again, if you're taking a very literal interpretation of 1 book is one story, 1 book is one story, so a trilogy is 3 books, 3 stories. This kind of throws a wrench in that plan, because this was intended to be one story. It was just so long, it had to be broken up into 2 books. Um, but it still tells, broadly speaking, one story. Each of these books is half of the same story. They, in my opinion, should count as one story. And if these were written by a different author, that wasn't Timothy Zahn, that had not written anything prior and would not write anything ever again, I think that author, hypothetically speaking, could be considered a one and done. Now, an interesting inverse of this is the case study with Michael Stackpole. Now, this one, a lot of you guys I know do know, is that Michael Stackpole wrote the Dark Tide duology for the New Jedi Order. But the Dark Tide duology was supposed to be the Dark Tide trilogy. There was a 3rd book, Dark Tide Siege, that was announced And as you can see by this amazing screenshot that someone found, was at one point so close to coming out that it had a listing on the old BarnesandNoble.com. However, Michael Stackpole got a 16-page memo from the editors on how to on changes to be made to the first book in the Dark Tide, what was into the trilogy. He disagreed with the changes and felt that the series would be too long, and instead wrote the series to only contain 2 books, basically shortening it from a trilogy to a duology. So in this case, what was originally scheduled to be a 3-book series ended up being a 2-book series because he did not feel the story he wanted to write could be drawn out for 3 books, and that it would be much better told in 2 books. Again, in a hypothetical scenario where this happens, but to a different author that's not Michael Stackpole, who only wrote that one story and who never wrote anything else prior to or since then, and say they had managed to pare it down even further by going down to only a book, you have the inverse problem where they were originally contracted to write out 3 stories, but they only ended up with 2 or maybe even 1 story or 1 book. But it's all the same story. They wrote 1 story. It just so happened that the story was the length of 2 books instead of 3. Is still, in this case, I would consider this hypothetical author that's not Michael Stackpole who wrote this, I would consider that an entry into only 1 story. Now, there's another case study which kind of muddles the waters here a little bit, and that there's actually 2 that are kind of in this camp, and that is the first of these is the case of Christie Golding. Now, Christie Golding wrote 3 Star Wars Legends books, the books 2, 5, and 8 of the Fate of the Jedi series. She was contracted to write these essentially as a replacement for Karen Traviss, who had taken the slot of the 2, 5, and 8 books in the previous 9-book series, Legacy of the Force, after she more or less quit Star Wars. So on her official Legends resume, she only has 3 books. Now, these 3 books aren't technically a trilogy. They're a part of a bigger series, and they're somewhat disconnected from each other. So I don't know if you could actually call this a trilogy, but she was, in a sense, contracted to write and help out on 1 story. The problem with Christie Golding, though, is that she was asked to come back to write Sword of the Jedi. But Sword of the Jedi, as I'm sure all of you know, was canceled when the EU was canceled. And they allegedly used that slot and the contract that they had with her so that she rewrote it into Dark Disciple for the new canon. We don't have actual confirmation that that's what happened, but the general consensus among the fandom is that is roughly what happened. So you have the case where the author was asked to come back, but their book that they were asked to come back to got canceled. Now, granted, I would not consider Christie Golding a one and done because, again, Allies, Omen, and Ascension, although they are 3 books, they're not a trilogy in the traditional sense, and they are more part of an overall story, and they each tell their own individual story. The 9-book series are kind of a lot different than anything that came before them, any of the dedicated trilogies, or even going back to New Jedi Order, the mini duologies and trilogies within New Jedi Order. They're each more so their own standalone books that tie into the overall story. But that's just my opinion. But it's still this situation of, if you're going to say that an author is a one-shot author, or one-and-done author, if they were only given 1 shot, well, Christie Golding was technically given 2. We just never saw the second one within Legends. Another case study exactly like that, of an author that was given a second shot but we never saw it, was William C. Dietz, who, of course, wrote the Dark Forces trilogy. These are also kind of controversial of what you would consider a novel or not. I personally do think they are novels, even though they are novellas. They did have a paperback and hardcover printing that you could get, and they read, and although they have lots of illustrations in them, they pretty much read like a novel. I would consider them novels. And they are 1 trilogy. William was asked to write 1 story that just happened to be over the span of 3 books, and he did so. But he was asked to come back. And he was asked to come back to write Escape from Dagu, the very famous, at this point, Lost Clone Wars novel that was discontinued because Del Rey got the green light to make Yoda Dark Rendezvous, and they shelved it, and it hasn't been released since. Although we're pretty sure there are copies of it out there somewhere, we just don't know where they are or if they'll ever see the light of day. But again, it's kind of muddies the point a little bit of the whole trilogy arguments, that trilogies are one story, or more to the point, it muddies the arguments that someone who is only contracted to write one story is a one shot, because technically speaking, these two were contracted to write two stories. It's just that only one of them ended up coming out. But those are just my thoughts. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know what you think of all this, and if you think that the authors who have only written one trilogy should be counted in the same or viewed in the same light as the authors who only wrote one book, if they are the same or if they are different. And also tell me why you think that. Like, what are some cases that I'm missing? What are some arguments that I'm not taking into account? Or why do you think the way you do? Again, my original intention for that post was to kind of spark a little more discussion on this topic. So please let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, take